People will go to some insane lengths to suppress their appetite and reduce hunger. So as a dietitian nutritionist, I feel obligated to review some of these methods and tell you my honest thoughts. Make sure to stick around till the end of the video because I'm going to be sharing with you the secret to actually getting to the core and to the root of the issue when it comes to feeling of uncontrollable appetite or feeling like you're out of control with food. Because as you might notice with some of these mentions today in the video, they treat the smoke and not the fire. So it's not really getting to the core of the issue. I do a lot of reaction videos like this one and review videos where I share my honest thoughts about different nutrition, fitness, and mindfulness topics. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely hit the subscribe button below. All right, let's go into the first method that I've seen going around. And this is definitely the one with the biggest shock factor, if you will. The first one is a shock collar. So people are using a shock collar of sorts to punish themselves when they feel hungry. And I feel like I shouldn't have to explain why this one is bad, but since it is a thing, I feel like I had to explain it. And originally I found this from an actual community board, and it really terrified me that people will go to such lengths to try to control or suppress their own body functions or natural feelings within their body. It's really truly scary to me. Punishment in general is not a good motivator of long-term change. A lot of times people try to talk negatively to themselves and bring themselves down and kind of be their own worst enemy, and they expect to see a change. But ultimately, our body really likes to fight back for what we truly need. And so when we're trying to restrict and deprive ourselves of, say, ice cream, for example, our body is naturally inclined to protect us against deprivation. And so we fixate on the food. We can't stop thinking about the food. We dream about the food until we go crazy and have as much food as possible of that specific food when we finally get around it again. And just back to the core of this, the shock collar. The more that you try to ignore your body and fight against it, the tougher it's going to be to have a healthy relationship with food and to repair that relationship with food. Actively harming ourselves when it comes to trying to suppress hunger is just going to disconnect us and further damage our relationship with food. So I highly recommend never ever doing something like this. And if you have the urge to, definitely talk to a dietitian who specializes in mindful and intuitive eating and maybe even eating disorders, and also talk to a therapist because they can both help you. Method number 2 that I've seen a lot is recommending to have more water. Now, water, of course, in itself is not an inherently bad thing. Of course, water is essential to life. So water itself, not bad. But I think the issue comes in when we're trying to mask hunger by using water. Because if you put enough in your body, like enough fluid in your body or enough celery in your body or whatever it is, if you put enough in your stomach, you're gonna temporarily not feel quite as hungry. That is true. But I think this is a good example of treating the smoke and not the fire. So you're treating the symptom of hunger by suppressing your appetite with water, when really you should be saying, oh, my stomach's growling. That means I'm actually physically hungry. That's not a bad thing. I'm not a bad person for being hungry. I should listen to my body and honor it. Like, I know that's so much easier said than done. The root of the issue is if you're hungry, you eat food. It's pretty straightforward. And when we try to mask it and treat the smoke and not the fire, it's never ever gonna go away long term. The hunger is not gonna go away long term until you eat something. So drink when you're thirsty and eat when you're hungry. That's the moral of this lesson. Method number 3 is self-monitoring or tracking foods. So when you track calories or track foods or photo log or anything like that, write it down, put it in an app, whatever it is, this is self-monitoring in some way, shape, or form. From a psychological standpoint, this can be motivating to reducing calorie intake or like reducing food intake short term, but I don't think it's always a good thing long term. Just like with anything, we can kind of psych ourselves out of being hungry and our body can kind of go with it temporarily. So just like with water, you're masking the smoke and you're treating the smoke, but you're not really treating the underlying issue. So we can kind of like think our way out of being hungry sometimes by means of self-monitoring or calorie counting, but I don't recommend this long term because I think it can just lead to too much obsessive behavior around food. And that's not really treating the core of the issue. Now, one thing I will say though, if you want to monitor temporarily, maybe for a couple days and see patterns. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes with clients, I will have clients who will tell me that they're over the top, ridiculously hungry, cannot control themselves at night. And then when we look back on it, they're not eating food from morning to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And that is a recipe for disaster. That is a recipe for setting you up for a binge eating cycle. And that's not because there's anything wrong with you. That's just because your body is meant to have food throughout the day, not just like starve, and then once that hunger really hits, then your body is taking as much food as possible. That's like a normal reaction to starvation and to depriving yourselves. And some people don't always think of that as true starvation, but your body is still threatened by it, and so it'll still fight to get you the calories that you need at the end of the day. For that reason, I will say that there can be a good thing to talking to a dietitian and maybe reflecting on your intake for a couple days in a row, but I don't think it's something that you need to do long term or all the time, because it's not something that we can always keep up long term, and it just doesn't set us up for building trust with food, because we feel like if we're not logging, then we're doing something wrong. And so that's what I want to warn you from. And one more thing I will say about the tracking and logging, if you do end up doing it, or even if you're just reflecting on foods, like you're not logging it, but you're just thinking about your day and thinking about how you could change your food, come at it from a point of curiosity versus judgment. So when we come at it from judgment, we're putting ourselves on the defensive, we're feeling bad about ourselves, feeling guilty about what we do, and that's really not a good way to build up a healthy relationship with food. So try to think of it from curiosity versus judgment. The fourth thing that I've seen quite a bit is eating high volume foods like cucumbers, apples, things that are voluminous in mass, but they're not high in calories. So celery is another one, carrots are another one. Soup is a high volume food, but oftentimes it's lower in calories. Here's where the difference between fullness and satisfaction comes into play. You can be full and not be satisfied. So if you had like a gallon of celery juice and downed the whole thing, you probably wouldn't want to eat anything after that, right? But would you be satisfied? Chances are, and no, it's a guaranteed no, you're not gonna be satisfied. So if you're satisfying your hunger with voluminous foods, say you have a big salad and say you have fruits and veggies on top of that salad, and then you also are having carbs, fat, and protein, and it's a mixture of things, and then you're full. That's a good thing, of course. But I think what we're worried about here is only focusing on the fact that a food is voluminous and not really caring or being mindful of what you want and what you're craving and what your body needs, and like having a balance of vitamins and minerals and nutrients. That's what we don't want, is to only focus on the fact that it's voluminous and not focusing at all about balance, because ultimately balance with food is what we're aiming for, right? If it's kind of a way to just suppress hunger and you're not really truly satisfied at the end of each meal, then that's when you need to reevaluate if that's something you truly want. The next method of reducing intake or reducing cravings of a certain food is to not have that food in your house or ban the food from your house. So this is again another very logical tip or logical bit of advice. I actually have a huge problem with this one, as logical as it is, because I think if you're banning foods from your house, you're not really teaching yourself or learning how to be at peace with that food or how to be in harmony with that food. I think the reason that you feel a lack of control around certain foods, let's just use ice cream as an example. The reason that you feel out of control with ice cream is probably because you are restricting it, not because you just have some crazy uncontrollable urge to have ice cream all the time. It's probably for a reason, and usually the reason is restriction and deprivation and putting good and bad foods on a pedestal, which I have a whole nother video about labeling foods as good and bad, so I can leave that in the description box or the end card so you can watch that as well. It doesn't allow you to have a peaceful relationship with food when you're telling yourself you have no control around food, because essentially you're telling yourself that you don't trust yourself, and it's really hard to build trust and do the opposite when you keep feeding yourself that narrative that you can't have any control around that food. Now, I'm not saying that it's impossible to binge a food. It definitely is. So I don't want to discount that. My best recommendation is to work with a dietitian if you are experiencing binge eating, because then you can have someone that can hold you accountable, and it's a licensed professional that can guide you through how to reincorporate the food slowly. And maybe sometimes you do have a binge, but eventually you habituate yourself towards that food, so it's not leading to these uncontrollable urges to have that food. The ideal thing is the reincorporation of the food and having it around so you can habituate yourself to it, and thus it kind of makes it less scary and makes that food lose its spark after a while, after you've like incorporated that enough times. It does take time. It's not like a one and done thing, but it's something that definitely I would recommend doing with a dietitian. I do a couple one-on-one clients, so if you're interested, I will leave my information below. Also, when reincorporating a food, I recommend doing so after a main meal. So say it's ice cream, having ice cream after a meal versus having it when you have really high primal hunger, because it's really, really, really hard to reincorporate that food in a gentle way when you're using primal hunger, not a gentle hunger. I did say that I would share with you my best tip for controlling cravings, and I kind of already mentioned it in this video, but that is unconditional permission to eat the foods that you love. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but when we deprive ourselves of the foods that we love, we have this primal drive to reincorporate that food back into our life, because our bodies look out for us. Our bodies have an innate need to help fuel us. And when we crave a certain food, oftentimes that's because we enjoy the food. It's part of our culture. It's part of our traditions. It's part of what we find palatable. And all foods can fit into your diet. So when we give ourselves unconditional permission to eat, you don't feel scared of when the next time you'll have the food is. So you tend to not overconsume or underconsume. You just consume what feels good to you and move on with life. So that is my best tip. And I do have more videos on this topic, so I will leave them in the description and in the end card, and I would love to chat with you more and hang out with you more, so definitely click those videos if you want to continue this conversation. Can't wait to talk to you all in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.